Okay, let's deep dive into something, well, fascinating. We often hear about cognitive biases, right? These mental shortcuts our brains take,
Mhm.
but they can sometimes lead us astray. And, it's surprising how often we don't even spot them.
Yeah, there was this global survey found only about 15% of adults could actually name confirmation bias. 15%.
Wow. Which really tells you these aren't just like abstract psychological ideas.
Not at all. They're influencing our decisions every single day, often completely under the radar. We're using these mental shortcuts without even realizing.
Exactly. And that's why this deep dive feels so timely. We're going to explore this whole field of debiasing.
Right, looking at the actual strategies and training methods being developed, all around the world.
The idea is to help people like you recognize these biases and, crucially, lessen their impact.
And we're drawing from this source essay that outlines different approaches. We'll look at what they are, how they're supposed to work on our thinking, and what the research mentions says about whether they're effective.
Moving from just being affected by bias to maybe actively managing it.
That's the goal. And it's happening now. The source gives some really interesting examples.
Like what?
Well, there's a mindfulness retreat in India, sort of framed as a bias detox. A school in London using specific cognitive forcing techniques in math class.
Right.
And even a tech company in South Korea putting bias inoculation ads in their onboarding for new hires.
So it's definitely a global thing. People are trying different angles.
Absolutely. Different cultures, different contexts, but a shared challenge. So let's maybe unpack some of the main strategies the source talks about.
That sounds good. Where does the source start us off?
Okay, first up is cognitive forcing. The name kind of gives it away.
Forcing your brain to do something differently.
Pretty much. It's about deliberately using mental checks or like checklist to catch yourself before you rely on a potentially biased shortcut. You force a pause.
Right, building in steps to make sure you consider other possibilities.
Exactly. Source gives a great example from medicine, citing Norman's work from back in 2009. Doctors using mnemonics like VIN-DICATE.
VIN-DICATE, what's that stand for?
It's vascular, infectious, neoplastic, degenerative. You get the idea. Each letter prompts a different category of potential diagnosis.
Ah, so it's not just a memory trick. It forces them to systematically think through all the categories.
Precisely. Instead of just lashing on to the first thing that pops into their head, the mnemonic forces a broader check. It ensures they don't anchor too early.
And does this forced process, does it actually work? Is there evidence?
Yeah, the source mentions experimental courses, I think in the US and Italy, that use these kinds of techniques. They saw about a 20% improvement in decision accuracy.
20%,
Yeah.
that's pretty substantial.
It is, by making people slow down and deliberately use that more analytical part of their brain. System 2, thinking it helps override those faster, often biased, System 1 intuitions.
But the source adds a note of caution, right? It's not a magic bullet.
True. It mentions uneven adoption. Basically, it requires discipline. You have to
Yeah.
consciously remember to use the checklist or the mnemonic, especially when you're under pressure or tired.
Right.
Richard Nisbett, who's a big name in this area, apparently advocates for these tools, but stresses that, yeah, they only work if you actually use them consistently.
Okay, so that's cognitive forcing, actively making yourself think differently. But the source also talks about something more internal, like mindfulness.
But it's careful to specify sociocognitive mindfulness.
Not just meditating.
No, it's less about clearing your mind and more about paying active, kind of non-judgmental attention to your own thoughts and assumptions as they happen, especially in social situations or when you're making a judgment.
Noticing your thoughts. How does that fight bias?
Well, the idea, backed by a study the source mentions Mayman and Langer, 2021, I think it was, on nature.com, is that this kind of conscious awareness helps you step outside your automatic patterns. By noticing your thought stream, seeing the assumptions embedded in it, you become less reliant on those unexamined shortcuts. That study, remarkably, claimed that inducing this mindful attention cut something like 19 out of 22 common biases.
Whoa, 19 out of 22. Just by paying closer attention to your thinking, that sounds almost too good to be true.
It's a striking finding, for sure. And this approach is definitely getting traction. The source mentions workshops in Australia teaching people specifically to notice their assumptions mindfully. And big companies like Google are apparently using things like mindful critical thinking training.
But is it always that effective? Does the source mention any downsides or limitations?
It does, and it's an important point. Not all the research is glowing. Some mindfulness programs, particularly those just focused on stress reduction, have shown kind of mixed results in controlled trials when it comes to actually reducing bias.
So the way it's framed matters.
It seems so. The source suggests that mindfulness aimed specifically at thinking about your thinking metacognition seems more promising for debiasing than programs just aimed at general stress relief. And tailoring it culturally helps too.
That makes sense. It's about the focus. Okay, what's next? The source brings up nudges. We've heard that term before, often linked with Richard Thaler.
Right, the Nobel winner. Nudging is basically about designing the choice environment, or how options are presented, to gently steer people toward the more rational decision without actually forbidding any options.
So instead of trying to change someone's thinking directly, you change the situation to make the less biased choice the easier or more obvious one.
Exactly. It could be simple things like putting warning labels on common heuristics that tend to trip people up in certain contexts. The source highlights some interesting work by an Israeli group, I think involving Cass Sunstein, on what they called meta-nudges.
Meta-nudges. Nudges about thinking.
Kind of. It's a nudge directed at your cognitive process itself, like sending an email reminder, hey, use a calculator for that estimate before you submit it.
Ah, I see. That directly counters the tendency to just rely on a quick mental guess, which might be anchored incorrectly.
Precisely. It interrupts that automatic, potentially biased process. The source also mentions tests on social media platforms in Asia.
Oh, yeah.
Pop-ups asking things like, are you sure? Check the source before you share something impulsively.
Another meta-nudge, trying to slow down that instant share reaction.
It prompts that little pause for thought, questioning credibility. Newsword was apparently doing trials on this sort of thing in 2023. It tackles confirmation bias, maybe the desire for social validation that drives quick sharing.
Interesting how nudging applies online, too. Okay, the next strategy sounds intriguing. Bias inoculation, like a mental vaccine.
That's exactly the analogy they use. It draws on inoculation theory. Psychologists like Stefan Lewandowski and Sander van der Linden are key figures here.
So how do you inoculate someone against bias?
The idea is you pre-expose people to weakened versions of manipulative arguments or misinformation tactics, like showing them how someone might use emotional language or cherry-pick data to mislead.
Ah, so you learn the tricks of the trade, and that helps you spot them later.
That's the theory. By recognizing the technique being used, you build up cognitive resistance, like cognitive antibodies. So you're less likely to be persuaded by the actual misinformation when you encounter it later.
Does the source say this works?
It seems to. It mentions global trials, US, Canada, Europe, showing that this kind of inoculation can cut susceptibility to misinformation by about 30%.
30% is quite a drop.
Yeah, it suggests that understanding the mechanics behind manipulation really helps people develop a more critical eye.
And it's not just for misinformation, right? The source mentioned classrooms.
Right. Teachers in places like Kenya and the UK using role-playing games. They might act out scenarios involving stereotypes about different cultures.
To pre-bunk them.
Exactly. By encountering and dissecting stereotypes in a safe, structured way, students get practice identifying and countering them. It inoculates them against internalizing those biases in their real interactions.
Fascinating. Okay, one more major strategy the source covers. Statistical training. This feels a bit different. How does learning stats help with psychological biases?
Well, the source frames it as a really powerful, almost fundamental debiasing tool. Because honestly, a lot of our biases stem from just being bad at intuitively understanding probability, risk, and numbers.
Like probability neglect. We worry about plane crashes, but not car accidents, even though statistics say driving is riskier.
Exactly that kind of thing. Our gut feelings about numbers are often way off. The source notes that even quite basic training in Bayesian reasoning in European schools helps students get better at judging probabilities correctly.
So learning the actual rules of numbers helps override faulty intuition.
That's the idea. Understanding concepts like base rates, how common something actually is overall, or how to interpret graphs properly gives you a rational framework. It helps you spot when your intuition or someone else's argument is statistically flawed.
And this kind of statistical literacy is seen as increasingly important.
Definitely. The source mentions big educational platforms like Khan Academy emphasizing these skills. And experts like Deborah Kerr argue that if we build this literacy from childhood, it acts as a long-term inoculation against a whole range of biases that rely on misinterpreting data or risk.
It makes sense. If you know the rules, You're better equipped to see when they're being broken, even by your own brain. Okay, so we've got cognitive forcing, mindfulness, nudges, inoculation, statistical training. Quite a toolkit.
And the source points out that developing these really draws on insights from many different experts.
Yeah, it names some key figures.
People like Daniel Kahneman,
Yeah.
obviously foundational work on heuristics, but also Susan Fiske on stereotyping, Art Markman on decision-making, Pamela Rutledge on media inoculation, Adam Grant on bias in organizations.
And importantly, it's not just a Western-centric view, is it?
No, the source makes a point of including insights from non-Western scholars, too. Heine on cultural mindsets, Yokochi looking at Japanese cognitive styles, Neeru Tandon working on educational bias training in India.
Which highlights that while the biases might be universal, how they show up and how best to tackle them can differ across cultures. It really is a global effort. So those are the external strategies and training. But the source argues there's something even more fundamental, a kind of final defense radar.
Yeah, it really emphasizes self-awareness and maybe a bit of intellectual humility. The argument is that the most reliable debiasing comes from developing this immunity through awareness.
Just being able to spot your own potentially biased thinking as it's happening.
Exactly, catching yourself in the act.
How do you actually build that radar? It sounds hard.
Well, the source suggests some practical tools. One is keeping a bias journal.
A journal just for biases.
Yeah. You consciously make a note whenever you catch yourself a thought, a feeling, a decision that seems like it might be driven by a bias. You just log it, maybe label it.
And the act of writing it down makes it more concrete.
It makes the implicit explicit. It trains your brain over time to become more sensitive to spotting these patterns. The source also mentions things like cognitive bias modification, CBM techniques, and using feedback loops, say, in work settings.
And what about that premortem idea for teams?
Ah, right, the premortem. It's basically the opposite of a postmortem analysis.
So before you start something.
Exactly. Before launching a project, the team gets together and imagines, okay, it's 6 months from now, and this project has totally failed. It's a disaster.
Okay. Big grim.
Yeah, but then they work backward. What could possibly have caused this epic failure? Everyone brainstorms potential reasons.
So it forces people to think about risks and downsides they might ignore when they're feeling optimistic or conforming to the group.
Precisely. It directly counters optimism bias and groupthink. It surfaces those potential blind spots.
That sounds incredibly useful. And the source suggests even small efforts in awareness can pay off.
Yeah, it cites research, mentioning frontiersin.org, indicating that even really brief interventions, like 10 or 15 minutes focused on bias awareness, can lead to measurable improvements in decision-making months down the line.
So it doesn't have to be some massive training program, just consistent, focused awareness practice helps.
It seems so, which leads nicely into the practical exercises the source suggests for you, the listener, to maybe try out.
Okay, let's hear them.
The first one ties back to that Langer mindfulness study. It's super simple. Just spend 5 minutes actively listing 3 new things you notice about your daily commute, or maybe your office space, things you've never consciously registered before.
3 new things. How does noticing like a crack in the pavement help with bias?
Well, the study suggested that this deliberate act of seeking novelty, of pushing past your usual filters, actually increases your overall conscious awareness. It breaks you out of autopilot perception. It trains your brain to pay more attention generally, to notice things that might contradict your assumptions. So it indirectly weakens your reliance on those automatic, potentially biased filters.
Simple but clever. What's the other exercise?
This one is about making that bias radar idea concrete. The suggestion is, for 1 week, keep a small notebook handy. Call it your bias radar journal.
Okay.
Each day, just jot down any cognitive bias you spot, maybe in the news, something someone says, a decision someone makes, or even in your own head. Try to give it a label if you can.
Like Tuesday, saw anchoring effect in that sales negotiation, or Wednesday. Definitely use confirmation bias reading that article.
Exactly, just note it down. Then at the end of the week, take a look back.
And see what patterns emerge.
Yeah. Which biases popped up most often? That can tell you a lot about what's prevalent around you, or maybe your own common pitfalls. And then the key step. Think about how one of the strategies we talked about, maybe cognitive forcing or a mindful pause or checking statistics, could be applied next time you see that bias in action.
So it connects the knowledge to real-world observation and practice.
Turning passive awareness into an active skill.
Wow, we've covered a lot of ground here. From those very structured external things like cognitive forcing, nudges, inoculation, stats training, all the way to the internal work of mindfulness and that self-monitoring bias radar.
And it really seems like, regardless of the specific technique, the source keeps coming back to awareness and practice being crucial.
Yeah, those seem to be the common threads. You need to notice it, and you need to work at countering it. It's not usually a one-shot fix.
It really does feel like building up a mental toolkit. So, as you, our listener, think about all this, and maybe you'll even try one of those exercises. Here's something to ponder. Which of these strategies really resonates with you? What feels like something you could actually try?
And maybe think about how even a small step, just noticing and naming a bias when you encounter it this week, how might that simple act start to shift your perspective or maybe lead to a slightly different decision? What stands out most to you from this deep dive?